So welcome to my webinar, Choosing a Journal to Publish Your Research. I'm Eric Robinson. I used to be one of the librarians on the San Marcos campus. I recently moved into a distance learning librarian position where I focus primarily on scholarly communications issues and managing our institutional repository. So this is all kind of coming from that angle, and I hope this is geared toward kind of late professional students and early professional faculty, or faculty that are maybe have been teaching for a while but getting around to publishing research, and just addressing some important questions in how to approach and evaluate journals to publish your research, especially in the new sort of environment where predatory publishers are an issue. I do have a separate webinar that I think is pretty useful on predatory publishing that I believe that one's been recorded and placed in the archive on the library website. So if those topics are interesting, I definitely encourage you to check that out as well. We've also got a guide on the library website that I'll refer to when we get to that point. But when we're talking about sort of evaluating a journal to publish your research, I'm sure you've all got a pretty good idea of what we mean. Basically, we're kind of thinking about the ideal journal that we want to publish our research in. So Nature is probably at the pinnacle of what most people would consider the ideal journal. Just a really high quality publication. It's really widely consulted. This one happens to be cross-disciplinary, but it's any ideal journal would be widely consulted with, at least within your field, if not across fields. Generally, these are really high-quality publications. That quality is usually evident within the sort of glossy layout in Nature and attention to detail in the format of the journal itself, but also in the editorial and peer review process. So these things, ideally, when we're thinking about scholarship, we want, and certainly when we're thinking about the scholarship that we're consulting, we want them to be highly peer-reviewed, have a very rigorous editorial process, so that we know that the information that we're getting in there has been validated and we can rely on it for our own research. But I think most importantly, when you're thinking about submitting, you certainly want to meet all of these criteria. But the most important thing for you is finding one that will publish your work. And that itself is kind of a challenge, given that lots of faculty and students and researchers everywhere are publishing, and really sort of, especially in this environment, really sort of swamping a lot of the publishers, which, as we'll talk about, has led to the rise of predatory publishers, which will certainly publish your work and charge you a fee, but they may shortcut these other criteria that we're talking about. So as a researcher, you certainly want to be able to publish your work in the highest quality journal that will accept your work. So that's kind of a constant balancing act, but you don't necessarily want to be taken in by the predatory ones, or publish. I'm assuming most people don't want to publish in a poorly reviewed or poorly edited journal, because that reflects badly on you as a researcher. Reflects potentially badly on your institution. But as a librarian, my view on that is that by taking part in that environment, you're also sort of contributing to the shoddy research that is sort of in that information landscape. By adhering to these more rigorous best practices and taking that into account when you're submitting your publishable work, you're also helping make sure that we're not swamping our information landscape with that potentially faulty research, poor methodology, poor critiquing, and that sort of thing. So obviously, the big thing that we're talking about is the journal's reputation. There's a number of things that we can look at to approach that, but among some of the more informal ways, if you've been in your field for a while, or if you're new to your field, certainly talking to your faculty members, consulting colleagues or mentors, as far as sort of asking them which journals they're consulting regularly, which ones have a status, a reputation of high status within your field. Obviously, there's thousands and thousands out there, but anyone who is practicing or teaching or researching in a given academic discipline has probably examined a wide number of them, and if they're reading critically, they'll have an idea of which ones are more rigorous, which ones are more difficult to publish in, which ones regularly publish material with shoddy methodology. So that's certainly one place you can do. You can look to get a sense of that. Most publishers will clearly indicate, or at least most reputable publishers, on their website will clearly indicate their editorial practices, their peer review policies, any fee structures that might take place, and you can examine those in the submission guidelines and get a sense of how rigorous you can expect that process to be. When you're reading, pay attention to your bibliographies. Any journals that are regularly being cited on a topic that you're reading heavily in are probably ones that would be worthwhile to submit to. And most importantly, I think, again, back to my status as a librarian, is when you do read journals, read them critically. Look very closely at editorial practices, methodology. Are there glaring errors of rigor that stand out to you in a paper? And does a journal, when you're looking at it, kind of regularly publish things with these glaring, what might be considered mistakes in methodology or reviewing practices that can kind of sort of earmark them as maybe less than rigorous and lower their status in your opinion. As new journals come out, particularly in the online environment, we're getting more and more journals that pop up fresh and new. So it becomes a little more challenging to identify those higher standard journals, because the journals that may have had an excellent reputation may still carry that reputation, but a brand new one may pop up, and that could either be horrendously bad or maybe taking the throne for the most highly acclaimed journal within your field. So as new ones come out, as you notice them being cited and appearing in the databases, take a moment to look them over and see if you think that they seem to be holding to some rigorous review and a high standard of publication, or if it stands out as low, and note that as well, so that you can kind of mark that at least as a lower status journal, or potentially predatory, as we'll talk about later. So that was just a brief kind of informal kind of approach to evaluating things. One of the biggest things that people consult is citation metrics, and there's any number of these. Sometimes they're referred to as bibliometrics or citation metrics, but basically they're a pretty good attempt at measuring how much impact that journal has in terms of how often the articles in that journal are being cited. So that's kind of the basic definition of what we're talking about. But things get a little tricky because of different practices within different fields. The number for a given impact measure may vary depending on the field that you're looking at. So, for example, I believe this is correct. The H5 is one of the indexes that we'll talk about in a moment. Is one that Google uses pretty heavily. The highest ranking science journal, is Nature. That's one of the reasons I picked that as my example. And it's got an H index of like 350 or something like that. That's a high number, and that means something according to the way that that's calculated and where it stands in the list of journals. But if you go over to the arts and humanities and look at an H5 index, say, I don't know, the Journal of American History, that might have an H5 index of 49, which doesn't compare at all to the 350 of Nature, but that might be the top journal in that field. So those numbers can vary pretty widely between disciplines. So you want to kind of keep a sense of what a given metric means within your field, and take that into account if you're transferring into a different field. So you might be publishing in rehabilitation, in the field of rehabilitation, but then maybe you write a paper that has something a little more to do with orthopedic surgery or something, and then when you switch into that field, you're like, oh, well, this one has a really low impact factor. I don't want to publish in that one, but it might be very high for that field. So I just want to make sure that that's clear. And as we talk about how they're calculated too, I think we'll get a little bit better sense of that. Another thing I want to point out on here is the way that these things can be manipulated. Obviously, these measures are important to publishers because they basically, not only do they serve as an indicator of the demand, they also create demand because people want to read the most highly cited, the most highly impactful journals in their field. That becomes a problem when publishers or individual authors are engaging in sort of self-dealing in the way that they cite within their work. So if I'm a publisher of a journal and I'm editing and I send it back to you and I'm like, yeah, great paper. I like the methodology. I like the content, but I think you should add more citations to my publisher's journals. You can pump up their numbers by sort of insidiously doing that, there's lots of different ways that can happen. That can boost an author's profile too with a lot of self-citation. But when you're looking to these things, they're a great start, but they're not the be-all, end-all of evaluating a journal because there are these kind of black box manipulations that can take place. And finally, a lot of these things are going to feed into each other. I'll be referring to predatory publishing probably in almost every single segment of this presentation. But fake metrics exist. So a predatory publisher might make up a metric and say, I've got an impact factoid of 300, but maybe that doesn't mean anything. It doesn't exist. There's no way to validate that. They just want to put a high number on their page to make their journal look important. So be aware of that, and we'll talk about metrics and validation later. One thing I want to really stress here is how dependent these are on the source of data that they tap. So the Journal of Citation Reports, who is the publisher that's responsible for the impact factor initially, that particular metric called the impact factor, they rely only on publications that they include within their sort of set of journals that they evaluate. So you might have a journal with 500 citations in a journal that's not included in that data set, and it won't be counted. So there's, again, part of that sort of black box is dependent on what journals they're looking to when they're counting citations. I already mentioned how those numbers can vary by discipline and how they can be manipulated. So that's actually sort of a duplicate slide. Just as an example, one of the most common ones is the impact factor. This is published every year by the Journal of Citation Reports. Again, as I mentioned, it gathers data from a specific set of journals that are part of their databases that they use for content, that they use for the citation analysis. And this one is just simply the average citation, the average number of citations of a journal in the previous 2 years. So let's say Nature has an impact factor of 3,000. That means in 2018, the number of citations in other journals appearing in this set of content totaled, say totaled 3,500 citations in all the journals in our data set. Divide that by the number of items that were published in there that could be citable, and by that they usually mean actual articles as opposed to maybe a book review or an editorial or something like that. A lot of times journals will publish things that aren't necessarily citable, and those are not counted. So it's really just the average number of citations for the previous year, for the previous 2 years, I'm sorry. That's a pretty simplistic one. Most of them are some variation of this or another one called the H5 index or H index. This one is the largest. This is a weird thing to think about, but it becomes pretty clear quickly with an example. So it's the largest number so that number of articles in the previous 5 years have that many citations each. So I think we skip down to the bottom and just make it concrete right away. Nature has an H5 of 362. That means that in the previous 5 years, when this was calculated in 2018, 362 of Nature's articles had 362 citations each. So that's that maximum number. There might have been an article in there with 600 citations, but where those two numbers settle in to equal each other is what we're looking at when we look at the H5. Okay. Fun fact. Again, we talked about the Google or the data set that's being used. So in Google Scholar, because they're scraping the web for their data and assembling these data sets from that affects the way that those citation factors are calculated. So they talk about the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, the PNAS, that I've got on my fun fact there. When they're scraping that data, they're trying to normalize that and make sure that everything is counted as the same thing. But they've seen 959 ways for people to refer to that journal. So that's potentially 959 different treatments of that. So those may not all be assembled into a single publication when they're actually calculating the citation. Okay, and again, that's for the previous 5 years. That's why it's called H5. Other journals will do an H2 or an H10. Excuse me. So the H5 would be published in July of 2018, and that would cover the previous 5 years, so 2013 to 2017. So those are two pretty typical examples of how those metrics are calculated. But when we're approaching them within sort of evaluating a journal, how do we make sense of those numbers, or how do we verify that that's a valid source? So when it comes to the predatory publishers, like I said, a lot of times they'll throw out a number and give it a citation factor sounding name, but that doesn't exist anywhere in the literature. You can't verify that. They may not even tell you how they calculate it because they may not even have an actual way of calculating it. So questions to ask yourself about those metrics is, can that be verified somewhere? Is there a publisher's website or the organization that's responsible for compiling that data into that metric, can that be verified somewhere? Wherever that is, do they disclose exactly what's included in that data set so that you know if things are missing, which journals are included in that calculation, or is there a really important journal that's being left out of it, or are they bringing in like the alt metrics, which brings in social media mentions, public policy mentions, things like that, because that makes a big difference in what those numbers look like. So you want to be aware of that. And do they share how that's calculated specifically? So some of the formulas, like the Scopus journal ranking number, it's another calculated citation metric, but that one is just ridiculous in terms of the mathematical formula that's in there. But they do put that out there if you want to know what goes into them calculating it. And finally, being aware of the disciplines. So those metrics can vary pretty widely depending on the discipline that you're in. and how does that number compare in this discipline versus that discipline, and be sure that you're sort of comparing apples to apples when you're looking at those metrics. There is another metric out there. There's lots of metrics out there, but there's one out there in particular I think that Scopus uses called SNP. It's the source normalized impact per paper. And that basically calculates a citation metric, but then normalizes it across all disciplines so that a 7 in English literature means the same thing as a 7 in high energy physics. That sort of indicates the same level of performance, the same level of status, regardless of the journal. So that's an interesting one to look at if you're actually looking at interdisciplinary or cross-disciplinary publication. A couple of resources. I'm going to try and switch back and forth between my screens here. I just want to give a couple examples of places that we can look to look into these metrics and to kind of dig up some information on them. So let me see if I can do this. Bring my Google window over. So we're just going to start with Google Scholar. On the Google Scholar page, they have a metrics tab on the side here. This gives you sort of the overall ranking of journals. And you can see they're showing the H5 index and the median H5, which is just the statistical median of all the articles in that journal. So you can see it lists the H5 index there. That's the same index that we just talked about calculating. But you can go in here and actually kind of drill down by category. So subcategories of medicine here. So I can get into nursing, and I can then see all the nursing studies. So let's see, just for example, H5 for the highest impact journal, at least within Google Scholar, is 65 for the International Journal of Nursing Studies. But if we jump out and we go into, let's say, anesthesiology, just for example, that number changes pretty significantly for the top number there. I can see my microphone is dying, so I'm going to turn that off and go to my main audio here in just 1 second. All right, can you guys still hear me okay? Can somebody respond that they can hear me? Okay, great. Thank you. Sorry about that. So you can see how that, not only how to drill down and find a good H5 impact within Google Scholar, but also see that difference between the impacts of the different academic disciplines. Another useful one is the Simago SJR. There are journal rankings in here. Same, very similar thing. This is within Simago, another academic journal indexing. You can see all the subject areas here, drill down by subspecialty. But what we're interested in is out here. They've got their own SJR ranking, which is that ridiculously complicated formula that I told you about before. They also list total citations for a 3-year period. Essentially cites per doc, which is essentially the impact factor over here, and the H index over here. And with this, this one I find particularly useful because you can choose, let's say, occupational therapy, and then sort that. I can sort that by sites per doc, which is the impact factor, and I can get those ranked in order of those sites per doc, or I can sort by impact, by H index, and see how that might potentially change. So this is a good way of just checking the citation metrics on these journals. I have a couple more on my page that I was going to show you. Where we go. Sorry, I have too many. There we go. Oh, yes. Elsevier, which is one of the major academic journal publishers, they have something called Journal Finder that is another sort of similar one, but I believe their data set is very limited to Elsevier journals. I'm not sure how widely. I haven't been able to verify that specifically. So, but the interesting thing about this one is that you can actually enter a paper title and abstract, and then have it find a journal, which then would be listed by impact factors and some of those citations. So let's just say I had a paper on autistic children and social, I'm just making up a title, but something to do with social play. So it's basically a keyword analysis. And then if I go into life and health sciences and click find a journal, it wants an abstract too, so I'm just going to do the same. And these are legitimate titles and abstracts. There's a lot more information for it to work with, but I just want to give you an example. So it'll load a number of results, and then you can see these things listed, but then you've got them by journal title. You can sort by impact factor, site score. They'll also indicate acceptance rate. So this is a place where you can get a sense of what percentage of papers submitted will actually be accepted by the journal. So that's quite useful. And then also indicates whether or not a journal allows open access, which we'll talk more about in just a minute. Okay, so there's a few tools that allow you to dig in and find, not only identify a subject within a journal within the subject that you're publishing in, but can also let you see the impacts and citation metrics for those. The library, the USA Library, has something somewhat similar. It's not exactly geared toward that, but if you go to journals here, there's a page that has a journal finder. So this is all of the journals within our EBSCO sort of package databases, and you can search those titles, but those titles also have subject heading listings. So so I can do a complex, say I'm just looking for autism journals. There's a whole list of autism journals there. This doesn't do the citation metrics, it just takes you into the library's collection of those articles. But the keywords and the titles and associations and things are a good way to search. That journal finder allows you to search and identify topics quite quickly. So let's do one on physical therapy. So that's as a keyword, but as a subject, I'll get quite a list as well. So you can see a wide range. Even I saw musical physical therapy in there somewhere. So a wide range of publications that you can identify by title, but more specifically, if you're looking for a journal to publish in by subject. Okay. Any questions on any of those before I move on? Okay. The one more that I want to mention, since I've got the time, is in PubMed. There's something called the eigenfactorizer. Eigenfactor is another citation metric, essentially, that's used to rank journals. So, but there's a little browser plugin. I don't know if you can see it at the top of my browser, right up here. It looks like a little brain. Basically, that runs as a plugin within your Chrome browser. I believe it works for Firefox as well. But what that does is highlights journals in PubMed for you as you're doing your PubMed search by color, so that you can see how high the influence on those is. So let's say we're doing physical therapy. do a random physical therapy search. Now, when that eigenfactorizer kicks in, you can start to see these things highlighted. And maybe Steve can pipe up if any of these things seem unrealistic, but you can see as far as the color code, BMC musculoskeletal disorders is showing as a fairly highly ranked one. Let's find a nice bright red one. American Journal of Sports Medicine is showing as a highly impactful one. So you can run that within your browser when you're searching through PubMed and see how these various journals perform. Okay. Journal of Sports Medicine and Physical Fitness. That one's showing a little on the lower end compared to American Sports Medicine. But I think that's a useful little tool for identifying influence as well. And then the last thing I wanted to mention, oops, jumping ahead of myself. When I talk about predatory publishing, there was a guy named Jeffrey Bayall who maintained for quite some time a list of publishers that were maybe a little more unethical, less than rigorous in their review, and really just in it for the money. Those are the ones that I would say might just make up a number that has no legitimate basis or actual calculated formulation or data set or anything. And in his information, he actually maintained a list of fake metrics, wide-ranging predatory publishers that would use the same sort of language to describe their citation. So that's kind of a useful thing to familiarize yourself with as well. Next up. So another thing to consider when you're evaluating journals for publication is open access. It's becoming more, particularly on the librarian side, but also on the author and researcher side, becoming more and more widely employed. So basically, it's just a slightly different economic model, but the main idea is that when you go to find an article, I'm sure you've all had the experience of going to find an article and turning up a paywall of some sort. You get this article, it's the perfect article, but they want $35 for it. Open access is a way to leverage the power of the internet so that when you come to an article like that, there is no barrier, or at least we're minimizing those barriers. So instead of the traditional publication model where the content would be created by the authors and given or sold for a song to the publishers, and then the publishers make their profit by selling it to the market, where the researchers or the librarians are paying the publisher at the point of consumption of the material, and that's where the profit's being made up in the model. On the open access model, instead of selling the product at the end of the whole process, the publishers are actually making their money when the authors convey the content to them. So either the author or the institution or a government funding agency the money transfer takes place when the publishers gain the content, not when they release it to the market. So what that means is the publishers already made their money at this stage. Sometimes these are substantial fees, but because they've recouped their profits, their costs and their profits here, when we get to the final stage, when they release it, so say to the market, although I think market's a bit of a misnomer, but when they release it to libraries or put it on the internet, or when someone wants to access that, they can then access it because the publisher doesn't need to sell it here because they've recouped their costs over here. Okay? A lot of people will conflate open access with predatory publishing, but that's not the case. Some of the most legitimate journals you can imagine have at least some form of an open access model that they might work with. The big thing is that there are these fees involved here, and sometimes they can be quite substantial, hundreds of dollars potentially. But if you're writing that into your research as a funding cost, then a lot of times that can be covered either by your institution or by a federal funding agency. So it doesn't have to come out of the author's pocket per se. The balance of that is that because that's released freely as open access at the point of consumption, the author's benefit to that is there's no paywall at that point. So the author, the researcher, is literally creating the widest audience that they can because there is no pay barrier for people that want to access that. So it is a bit of a trade-off, but most of the authors are not publishing in order to make royalties on their academic journal research. It's more for the prestige, the recognition, the impact, and hoping that their work will get used, right? So that's the sort of economic model for that. Typically, it takes place in a couple different varieties. So we'll often refer to open access gold, which is essentially what I was talking about. The author or the publisher charges at that point when they acquire the content, but then they can publish that final version as open access immediately. Green is another kind of variety of that, where the publisher may have some fairly traditional practices, but they might allow the author to pay a charge so that they can make it available by open access. Typically, that takes the form of the publisher will publish the final packaged version in a journal and on their website, but the author can archive maybe a post-reviewed manuscript or maybe even the final published version. I'll talk about some resources for how we can identify that as well. But the main questions to ask here, since 2008, I believe it was, any research that takes federal funding is required to publish in an open access forum. So there was a law passed that was basically saying, the taxpayers are paying for all this scientific grant funding, but then they've paid for it, but they can't even access the research because it's behind these publishers' paywalls. So the federal government, both here and in Britain, kind of took a leading role in making that a requirement if you've received federal funding. So that might be one factor if you really want to do that. Is that whole important to you as a researcher, as an author, sort of ideologically, in terms of people being able to access that information? So you might want to consider highly whether or not you want to publish in that model or not. When it comes to working with your publisher, typically they will have some policy in place where they may allow you to archive preprints. They may allow you to, but by preprints I mean like the original manuscript, maybe before the actual peer review process. They may allow you to archive postprints, which would be the final manuscript minus the sort of fancy formatting of the publisher. Or many now will even allow you to publish the final publisher version, which would be that PDF exactly as it appears in the printed journal. So there may be different levels of that, and how you want to make that available if you want to be part of the movement that's pressing for open access. How you want to make that available is one of the questions. Okay. Before I move on to author rates, I want to go back into the web for just a second. Oops. So two resources that are particularly useful on that is the Directory of Open Access Journals. So this is a worldwide directory of journals that have open access policies. They, again, like the other things that we've seen, they're searchable by subject, but the main thing I want to show you on here is that within a given subject, let's say I find one of the journals, I can list the journals here. They have a brief entry on each one of those, and they'll list any publication charges, what the open access policies are, and give lots of information about their peer review process and everything else. DOAJ has a fairly rigorous criteria for inclusion, so a lot of the more predatory publishers will be screened by this. So you might consider, if you are considering open access publishing or a fee structure, you can search in here and see if DOAJ lists them, and if they do list them, there's this green check here, or a DOAJ seal. It's an even higher level, which means the check means it's gone through a more rigorous screening process that was put in place in March 2014. The seal is more of a, does it adhere to best practices in terms of really making that information available. But you can search that and get a good sense of what policies are and what any charges might be. When it comes to the actual archiving, so if you want to say in the SOAR institutional repository at USA, if you wanted to include your work within the institutional repository or do some sort of self-archiving, there's something called Sherpa Romeo. This is a database of copyright policies of individual journals. So I was just working with some faculty who had published in the Turkish Online Journal of Distance Education, and I wanted to reach out to them and have them include their work in SOAR. So if am I getting this right? Screw journal name. Let's try it this way. Let's do Turkish Journal of Education. So I can search that title. I can pull up an entry for that title. DOAJ lists that one as open access. Let me try it with this. That's not the one I want. I know it was something distance education. Darn it. Sorry, I thought I had that all set up to go. I'm not going to waste too much time on this. One more try. There we go. Turkish Online Journal of Distance Education. So I get that entry up. You can see it listed as a green journal, meaning it's green open access. That publisher not only allows preprints and postprints, but they may even allow the publisher's final version. More often than not, the publisher will allow at least a postprint, and a surprising number of them will allow you to archive in a repository the exact publisher version that they have. They may just have a delay, maybe 6 months or something on before you can publish it in there. Okay. Any questions on that? I know the open access and preprints and postprints and repositories can be a bit confusing. Okay. All right. Let's move on to, I'm getting a little short on time. Another big thing that I'd like you to consider very closely is retaining your author rights. So as the author, unless you transfer your copyright away in a contract with a publisher, you retain well, all of these rights of reproduction, distribution. So you can do with it whatever you want. If you want to post it in an archive and never put it in a journal, you certainly can. A lot of people want that journal because people will go to it and they'll get their audience because of the reputation of the journal. But more and more people are sharing that research through repositories and through open access journals. So maintaining those rights for yourself to be able to do that can not only increase your audience because you're not going to run into those paywalls and paper's a little more citable. It also allows you to do what you want with that content at any point down the line. So unless you retain those rights, when you sign your publisher contract, you may want to include a table in a textbook down the line, or you may want to put that article in an institutional repository, or use it in a course or something. And if you haven't retained those rights, and the publisher actually owns that, then you can have problems with that. So when it comes to actually signing publishing contracts, those are more often than not, you have some input into that. They may have a boilerplate contract that they'll put in front of you, but that is negotiable. If you understand the basics of copyright and can tell them what's important to you as far as open access or as far as reuse of that content, get that listed out, you can get that, very likely get that included in your publishing contract. There's some sort of tips on here about, you know, having those conversations in person so that you can really make your point and not just get a response that says, well, this is our contract. You can really emphasize the importance of those things, and frame it in a way as far as, you know, my funding requires it or my institution requires it, and really put your needs out there and kind of work with them. Obviously, they have their priorities and their needs, but most are willing to work with you to some extent. And of course, whatever exceptions or differences to the contract that made, you want to be sure that those are in the final contract in writing before you close the deal. That can be a little intimidating for people when you start talking about legal contracts and copyright and stuff like that. But there's a number of things out there to kind of make that a little bit easier. So the University of St. Augustine Library has a guide that's just sort of a basic introduction to copyright. But I think the U.S. Copyright Office circular on copyright basics really does a good job of laying out what copyright is, why it exists, and what rights you're granted by that. But when it comes to the contracts, SPARC, which is a scholarly publishing association, they put out a brochure and an author rights addendum that is a sort of takes you through that contract negotiation process. I think that's one of the single most useful resources I've found when it comes to author rights. So they have a nice little web page there that's useful, but more importantly, that actual addendum, which is just a simple publication addendum to whatever publication agreement you have. That's sort of boilerplate language for the kinds of things. For the kinds of things that you might want to retain. So you can fill that out, send that off to the publisher, and just have that included as part of your contract to see what, to be able to maintain a lot of the rights that we were talking about. Okay, so will your publisher allow you to do that is certainly an important question. How much will they allow? What are you required in terms of your grant funding and your publication? Those are all questions that go into that author rights section. So finally, I mentioned it, I believe, in every section, just like I promised, but the predatory publishers, predatory journals. So as the open access movement really started to gain ground, there were unethical people out there that said, oh, they're charging $1,500 to publish an article as open access. I can create a website and just rake in these article fees and drive up a huge profit. But there came to be recognized this movement of these really deceptive practices and these flash-in-the-pan journals that may exist for 6 months while they rolled in some money, or they may charge these fees and then the journal disappears. So they may promise to publish it, they may promise peer review and rigorous editorial practices, but they don't actually adhere to that. Mainly these things are profit-driven and deceptive. The volume-driven part of that is that the more articles that they're turning over and turning out, the more money they're making. So their attention is not on, is this good research, is this a quality paper? It's on how many papers can we publish on our website. So they're really exploiting academics' need to publish their work that way. I mentioned Jeffrey Bayall. He listed a few criteria that stood him. His original paper was in 2013, but this 2016 paper really lays it out well. Number one thing is they don't adhere to broadly accepted standards of scholarly publication. So peer review, ethical publication, ethical research, rigorous methodology, they don't care. They just want to get that money transferred and put the paper on the website so they can move on to the next victim. A lot of times they'll list the same editorial board on several different journals, and that editorial board may or may not even be legit. You might find somebody might list Steve Lazlovich on their journal, but you go talk to Steve Lazlovich and he's never heard of that journal. That's another big flag. So you can verify that by checking with the individuals, looking at the individuals' pages of the editorial board. If someone is included as on the editorial board of a journal, they're very likely going to list that in their own CV. So just do your due diligence and dig in to see if that's legitimate or not. The center of operations for these, so where the headquarters are, is often misleading, vague, opaque, unexpressed. So they might do everything they can to make you think that they're located in Boston at MIT or in Cambridge at MIT, but they're actually somewhere in Thailand. So that's one of the other criteria that jumped out. They may try to allude to some institutional affiliation or particular editor, prestigious editor that isn't actual. So those deceitful ties to prestigious institutions is another flag. And more often than not, these things some of you may have already received them, these sort of mass messaging solicitations where they reach out and they're like, oh, we think your research is amazing and we would love to include it in our journal for a low author processing charge of $50. And then you're like, oh, they're going to publish my research and they're flattering me and that sounds great. But they're really just sending out these mass emails to get as many submissions as they can. They may turn around in their peer review process and, if they have any at all, their peer review process may be very brief. Like they turn it around in 2 weeks and they just tell you to add a reference or something, something really sketchy like that. Some things that you can ask yourself to sift out whether or not these are actual predatory journals or not. ISSN numbers, I don't know if you're familiar with those, but they're basically like ISBN numbers, that sort of barcoded serial number for a journal publication. You can search those in PubMed, you can search those in the library's journal finder that I demonstrated earlier. They may list fake ISSNs if they're predatory. They may not list one at all. Most will have one if it's been around and is legitimate. You should be able to see back issues. If it's only been around for 6 months, it could be good. It could be a quality journal that just started up, but chances are, if it's only been around for a very short period of time and you can't see issues going back 5 or 10 years, that it's probably one of these flash in the pan predators. Any fee structures should be clearly communicated, as should their peer review process. I mentioned verifying editors or institutional affiliations, and the last one is appropriate scope. So because these things are just mass volume driven, they may be publishing a journal on high energy physics or an article on high energy physics next to an article on molecular biology. Most journals have a scope for a reason, because they're catering to an audience. Certainly there are interdisciplinary journals that have a broader scope or crossover between fields. But if you're skimming the contents of these things and really, really wide-ranging or seem to have nothing to do with each other, that's a pretty big red flag. So there's a few references on there. This will be recorded, as I mentioned. We're recording now, so you can consult this through the library website when it gets posted there. I'll leave it up for just a minute. But the last thing I wanted to do before you guys take off is just for our references and so that I can improve this in the future. I'd like to, let's see, I believe I can do a quick poll in here. Oh, it's not letting me. So I'm just going to say in the chat, if you want to do private chat to me, that's certainly fine. But if you could just answer a couple of questions for me so I can tweak this in the future. I'll open up the questions in just a minute, but I want to make sure I get this part out. Was this presentation useful for you? Just yes or no? If it was, what was useful? And if it wasn't, what would you have liked to have seen covered? If you could just throw that in the chat for me, I'd appreciate it. And while that's going down, I'll open it up to questions if anybody has any. Nope. Okay. Well, I do hope you'll give me the feedback there. Was it useful, so I can record that in our statistics and also so that I can improve the presentation for people in the future. I'll go ahead and take it back to the references for you while we're waiting. If you have any questions, you can certainly contact me. My email is just erobinson, ROBINSON @USA. I can speak with you more directly on some of these things or share some additional resources if you have some specific questions. But I'll also be developing this presentation into a library guide. So through the library webpage, the library resources, there's some like A to Z guides on how to do things. This will be in there as well. All right. All right. Well, I appreciate you guys coming out. I hope everything was useful. Steve, I see your microphone come on. Steve, do you have a question?
No. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Yeah. All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
All right. Take care, guys. Bye-bye.